This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you Episode 8 of Season 2 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Westford Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, February 20th, 1909. I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford 114 years ago as we read. The first section in February 20th, 1909 was Westford Center. Miss Harriet Miller, formerly one of the successful teachers at the old Center Primary School, was a weekend guest in town visiting with her former associate teacher, Miss Cushing. Miss Miller is now teaching in Attleboro. Miss Nellie Fletcher is convalescent from a siege with grippe. Mrs. Herbert V. Fletcher has been enjoying several days this week as the guest of the Henry M. Wrights at their pleasant home in Quincy. Mrs. John M. Fletcher has been confined to the house the last 2 weeks with one of the prevailing colds. Patrick O'Connor, employed by Abile J. Abbott, underwent an operation for appendicitis at his home on Saturday, performed by Doctors Metcalf, Wells, and Sherman. Patrick O'Connor was probably from Ireland, as the Abbotts often employed Irish workers over the years for help at their large house on Main Street. Mr. and Mrs. Leonard W. Wheeler entertained a group of about a dozen friends at their home last week Friday evening. Their home was located right across the street from Rodenbush, which at that time was Westford Academy. Coming so near February 14th, the entertainment, decorations, and refreshments were all in harmony with the happy spirit of St. Valentine. There is an especially fine set of views on exhibition at the library of Shakespearean subjects, including people and scenes from his writings. An auction sale was held at the home of Mrs. Mary E. Fletcher. Her maiden name was Mary Eliza Layton. On Tuesday afternoon, it was to dispose to the highest bidder a miscellaneous lot of articles, a clearing up of things in barns and sheds, also some household furniture. A good number were present, and auctioneer S.P. Emerson found purchasers for all that was for sale. Cards are out announcing the marriage of Miss Mary Alice Morrill and Dr. Orion Vassar Wells at Amesbury, February 17th. Dr. Wells, who was a Westford doctor, young Westford doctor, would die during the 1918 influenza epidemic. Mrs. Wells continued to live on in Westford for a number of years after his death. The next section is called Accident. The many Westford people who remember Miss Ida M. Manuel, the former teacher at the academy, so pleasantly, were distressed to hear the very serious accident that she met with at her home in Franklin, New Hampshire last week, caused by a runaway horse. Miss Manuel was teaching in her hometown and, as was her custom, started to drive to the center, about a mile from her home. The horse, which was a nervous animal, took fright at something and ran, finally colliding with the corner of a paper mill with such force as to throw Miss Manuel out and through a large window, striking shoulder first against some machinery. She was picked up in what at first seemed a more dead than alive condition. Upon examination, it was found that her shoulder was broken, 3 ribs broken, and internal injuries inflicted. It was the horse's last runaway, for he was killed in the collision. The last report was that Miss Manuel was resting as comfortably as could be expected under the circumstances, but it will be many weeks before she can get back to the normal good health and capable activity characteristic of her. She made many friends here who feel the sincerest sympathy for her in her serious accident. The next section is called Celebration. The schools at the center joined in observing the Lincoln Centenary at the Town Hall last week, Friday morning, with a program of commendable excellence. Of course, Lincoln was born February 12, 1809, so this marked his 100th birthday. This was listened to by many interested parents and friends. Reverends Benjamin H. Bailey and Charles B. Marshall contributed words of wisdom. Mr. Bailey, who was in Washington at the time of Lincoln's assassination, was listened to by the pupils with great interest, as well as by the older ones present. The next section is called Club, and it's, as usual, about the Tadmouth Women's Club. It was a regrettable fact that the storm of snow and sleet only made it possible for those who can go out in all weathers to be present at the Tadmouth Club Tuesday afternoon in Library Hall, for it was one of the many programs that proved genuinely worthwhile. Near the speaker's table was a flag-draped picture of Abraham Lincoln. Mrs. J. Herbert Fletcher read Leo Tolstoy's tribute to the great martyred president. And Miss Clara Smith read Julia Ward Howe's poem on Lincoln. I'll mention more about these later, which was read by this remarkable woman of 90 years at Symphony Hall, Boston, last week at the Lincoln celebration. Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy, born 1828, died 1910, wrote of a tribal chieftain he met at the isolated Caucasus, who asked him about Abraham Lincoln, the greatest general and greatest ruler of the world. That last phrase is in quotes. The greatest general and the greatest ruler of the world is Tolstoy's quote from this isolated tribal chieftain in the Caucasus. Tolstoy wrote that Lincoln, quote, overshadows all other national heroes, end quote. And Julia Ward Howe, born 1819, died 1910, author in 1862 of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, wrote the poem Lincoln, specifically for the 1909 Lincoln Centenary. The club members would gladly have taken more time with this part of the program, but it was the afternoon for Miss Martha J. Taylor's paper on a motor trip through Great Britain, which was an account of a trip enjoyed by Miss Taylor with the Donald Camerons in the spring and early summer of last year. With fluency and simplicity, Miss Taylor delineated the great beauty of the English country, many of its towns and villages, its wealth of literary and historical association, its cathedrals and colleges, and its beautiful lake region. She gave brief accounts of the trips into Scotland and Wales. The paper was illustrated with many views and a map of the route drawn by herself. It was a vivid and delightful account of nearly 5,000 miles of most enjoyable travel that Miss Taylor shared with the members of her home club and was heartily appreciated by them. The subject of the next meeting, March 2nd, which was to have been the reading of a Shakespearean play, has been changed to an evening with the poet Edgar Allan Poe, who is one of the many celebrated people whose centenary comes this year. Poe was born on January 19th, 1809, in Boston, and he died on October 7th, 1849, in Baltimore, Maryland. The next section is called Lecture. The Grange Lecture and Entertainment course came to a close last week, Thursday evening, with a lecture of unusual merit. Frederick M. Brooks of Boston was the lecturer with, quote, Alaska of Today, end quote, for his subject. It was illustrated profusely with beautiful colored slides, manipulated with special smoothness. The next section is Birthday. It was Mrs. Elizabeth Perkins. Her maiden name was Elizabeth Porter Tobie, T-O-B-I-E, widow of Fletcher Perkins, who died in 1905, 83rd birthday anniversary on Tuesday, February 16th, and her good neighbor, Mrs. Donald L. Grieg, carried out the happy thought of making the day a special occasion for Mrs. Perkins. Word was passed about among neighbors and friends, who responded by coming and bringing good cheer and wishes for happy returns of the day. They also brought many little gifts. Mrs. Grieg made a fine birthday cake suitably inscribed for the recipient. Peaches and whipped cream, cocoa and cake were served, and a good time enjoyed by all, particularly Mrs. Perkins, whose unfailing good cheer has won her many friends. The next section is called Congregational. Reverend T.C.H. Booton, B-O-U-T-O-N, of Chelmsford, who exchanged pulpits with Mr. Marshall last Sunday, gave his hearers an able sermon. Miss May Atwood, the faithful organist, who has been confined to the house for a week with cold and sore throat, was unable to be present, and Mrs. Marshall presided at the organ with her usual skill. In the evening, Miss Grace Lombard led a good meeting from the subject, Lessons from the Life of Job. This was probably the Christian Endeavor meeting. The next section is called Social. The teacher's social at the Congregational Vestry Wednesday evening was one of the pleasant social events of the week. A large number came out to meet their friends and to hear the program, consisting of music, readings, and a play. Arthur Day and John Grieg gave some fine solos, and John A. Taylor read most acceptably some schoolmaster's experiences, after which a short play was given entitled The Modern Sewing Society. The following ladies took part in the play The Modern Sewing Society. Mrs. President, age 45 and dignified, was played by Miss Loker. Mrs. Know-all, age 45 and excitable, was Mrs. Lillian Lombard. Mrs. Wise, age 35 and calm, was played by Mrs. Leonard Wheeler. Mrs. Short, 45 and pert, was played by Mrs. William Woodward. Mrs. Green, age 50 and countrified, was Miss Ruth Tuttle. Mrs. Brown, age 50 and very deaf, was played by Mrs. D.L. Grieg. Mrs. Jones, 30 and stylish, was played by Miss Marguerite Bannister. Mrs. Gossip, 45 and talkative, by Mrs. J.E. Knight. Mrs. Truthful, 45 and honest, was played by Mrs. Alfred W. Hartford. Miss Chatter, 25 and up-to-date, was played by Miss Elizabeth Cushing. Miss Flutter, 25 and mischievous, played by Miss Ruby Carter. Miss Simple, 35 and plain, played by Miss Eva Pine. Miss Pert, 35 and disagreeable, played by Miss Grant. And Miss Small, 22 and pretty, by Miss Francis, played by Miss Frances Bannister. The next section is Forge Village. While John Bratz, clerk for Conant and Company of Littleton, was taking orders one day this week, his horse wandered onto the electric car track, and the wagon was struck by a car and demolished, but the horse was not injured. It is supposed that owing to the slippery condition of the rails, the motorman was unable to stop the car in time to avert the accident. Mr. Bratz obtained a sleigh and harness of W.E. Parsons and continued on his route. The members of the Ladies' Social Club of St. Andrew's Mission gave their annual supper and entertainment to the vestrymen and recreation hall last week, Wednesday evening. Notwithstanding the inclemency of the weather, there were a goodly number present. Supper was served from 6:30 to 8 o'clock, after which a program of considerable merit was given. Miss E. Marion Swett had charge of the entertainment and deserves much credit for the able manner in which it was carried out. After the concert was over, dancing was enjoyed by a large number, Miss Swett furnishing the music. The next section is the About Town section. The recent accident to Frank D. McGlinchey has proved more serious than was at first anticipated. Soon after the accident, he was removed to the Lowell General Hospital by Dr. Varney of North Chelmsford. His improvement not being indicative of recovery, a consultation of physicians decided on a surgical operation. As a result, a piece of bone about 1.5 inches in circumference and a clot of blood were removed from the brain and a silver frame inserted. He now lies in a critical condition and is conscious only a few moments at a time. You may recall from about 2 weeks ago that Mr. McGlinchey was seriously injured at the Herbert E. Fletcher Company's stone quarry, but actually it was at the old Moore Mill, I believe in Brookside, by being struck on the head by a metal beam. The management of the Fortnightly Club Club have made an important change in the program for Friday evening, February 26th, having invited DeLacy Corkum of Billerica, one of the best-known and ablest offhand orators and debaters in Middlesex North, to a joint debate on the question, quote, resolved that we are influenced more by the company we keep than by the literature we read, end quote. Mr. Corkum will speak on the negative of this question. The writer, that is Samuel Taylor, has not had any official notice from the club that he is to be joined against Mr. Corkum in this debate, but has had unofficial notice to that effect and is getting his gunpowder, lightning, and thunder into working order for the grand display of fireworks that is coming. So DeLacy Corkum and Sam Taylor were two of the widely known orators in northern Middlesex County 100 years ago. Lincoln Day was observed by the Fortnightly Club of North Westford at the Wright Schoolhouse on Groton Road last week, Friday evening. J. Everett Woods gave interesting reminiscences of the early struggles and anecdotes in the life of Lincoln. Hiram Dane, as a Civil War veteran, spoke along the lines of Lincoln and the Civil War. Mrs. Smith entertained with patriotic selections on the phonograph. Charles Eaton gave the audience Hail Columbia on the harmonica in more ways than one. Sometimes it was to the tune of Yankee Doodle, and sometimes it was Down in Dixie. But wherever and whatever, he caught the musical ear of the audience. Mrs. Walter Wyman read extracts from the Gettysburg speech and other selections with appreciative effect. This was followed by the recitation of one of Lincoln's favorite poems by Miss Lucy Lumbert, that was mentioned previously. The last to pop up and do serenade duty in memory of Lincoln was Samuel L. Taylor, who brought the greetings of the school celebration at Westford Center held in the forenoon. After a preliminary flapping of the air in various ways, he made a sudden right swing and emphasized the sublime dignity of daily life and common duty, and that each can be a Lincoln without presidency or assassination. The next section is called Dance. It was a surprise that the advertised social gathering of the dancing variety to raise funds to purchase a new piano for the Academy, which event was held at the Town Hall last week, Friday evening, should also have resolved itself into a memory of St. Valentine's Day, and thus this ancient saint got a premature notification that society had a useful remembrance for him, yet in a sort of co-partnership observance with Lincoln, February 12th. As St. Valentine's Day came on Sunday, sensible saints thought it more saintly to merge with Lincoln and thus form a saints' merger. The hall was highly and appropriately decorated, and everyone could find some fitting emblem of, quote, the day we celebrate, end quote. The picture decorations were loaned by the Westford Athletic Association. The evergreen decorations were the gift of nature, and her children generously gathered and tastefully arranged. The Grange Orchestra furnished music, and about 100 couples assisted with signs made with the feet in interpreting the meaning of the music. For transportation, that last car on the electric road not now being a last car, barge loads came from the villages of the town and from West Chelmsford, Littleton, and Ayer. The yield of the evening was $110 plus pleasure. That was a pretty good sum for dances and dinners of the occasion 100 years ago. The WCTU held a banquet and social at the home of Mrs. J.E. Whitney last Saturday evening. 26 members and associate members were present. Selections on the phonograph were given by Mr. Whitney, piano selections by Mrs. Charles P. Marshall, instrumental duet selections by Edith Wright and Grace Lumbert, college songs and hymns, and a merry all-around time were enjoyed by the congregation, after which ice cream, fitted to the ability of all, found no lack of ability to perform this easy task. By the way, ice cream is given as one word in this instance, and fairly often 100 years ago, where we obviously use two words for it now. This time of year is close to the time when nominations will be in order for town officers. There are important vacancies to be filled, or else the vibrations in the air and more substantial evidence are unreliable. The substantial so-so is out and around that Wesley O. Hawkes, the faithful, competent, and good-natured selectman, will not accept a renomination. The names thus far mentioned for the place are Andrew Johnson, P. Henry Harrington, Joseph Wall, and others whose names are simply an echo of possibility. Also, there will certainly be a vacancy on the Board of Assessors. The reference in this paragraph is to Samuel Law Taylor, the correspondent for the Westford Wardsman, the About Town section. This is as reliable as the Earth is in its orbit, if not so swift in getting around. Much obliged, fellow citizens, for over 15 years of patience with about an equal blending of ignorance and negligence. The fragrance of the roses in this path will long be remembered with the memory of the good and true he has served with. The thorns will also be remembered as evidence of the compensation derived from meddling with other people's affairs, like the memory of meddling with the business end of a wasp doth it remain. To his successor he gladly hands the roses. The thorns will arrive on scheduled time as he develops the play. The only regret at vacating is the annual town farm dinner. But then the future hath its bright side. Who knows but there may be 365 such dinners there in a year. Be this as it may, one thing is certain: unless there is a decline in the appetite with declining years, as a daily boarder it would raise the tax rate. So what he's saying, he's resigning from the Board of Assessors, and he's saying that perhaps he'll end up in the town farm being cared for by the staff there, and we'll get 365 town farm dinners a year. The next section is the Graniteville section. Observance of Lincoln's birthday was fittingly carried out here last week, Friday, when appropriate exercises were held in Sergeant School in the morning. No session was held in the afternoon, and many of the scholars in the higher grades enjoyed the excellent skating on Mill Pond. Many of the young people of this village attended the Academy dancing party held in Westford last week Friday evening and had a very enjoyable time. The members of the Young Ladies Swastika Club of this village held a social dancing party in Ford's Village on Friday evening, February 19th. The Swastika Club had nothing to do with the German Nazi Party. That wasn't even around in 1909. The swastika was a common symbol in the 1920s. It was really an ancient religious symbol and was also used widely by Native Americans, particularly in the southwestern U.S. It was often considered a symbol of good luck, and perhaps this was the intent in so naming it by this club. That's the news in Westford for the week ending February 20th, 1909. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Nick Woodbury of Westford Cat for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Westford Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org, or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from a century ago. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.